Not in the short run, it seems. And the reason why I think it would be naive to expect any radical improvement in the Turkey-US relationship in the short run is due to two factors. The first factor is that each side, both Ankara and Washington, have legitimate grievances against each other. From Ankara's perspective, this is about the lack of empathy on the side of US administration concerning the Gülen network in the US. Secondly, the US help to the Syrian Kurdish entity PYD, which is seen as a terrorist organization by Turkey, and also the lack of political support in a number of regional issues. From the US perspective as well, there may certainly be a number of legitimate grievances concerning the Turkish decision-making, the purchase of the S-400 missile defense systems from Russia, and now the ongoing Zarrab case in the United States, which is about an alleged violation of the Iran sanctions. But even more importantly, I think that unlike in the past where this relationship have had its difficult moments, but nonetheless diplomacy prevailed and the political leadership did prioritize the settling of those disputes. Today we live in a different environment where we have two quite populist leaders on both sides, and that have instead looked at these differences also and sometimes more exclusively from a domestic angle, and have instrumentalized these differences used for domestic political objectives. And I think this is what makes also the relationship so brittle. The combination of these set of unaddressed grievances and differences with a political rhetoric that has over time fueled these differences, has also impacted public opinion. So today in Turkey, the US has a very negative outlook. According to some recent opinion poll, the support or the percentage of Turkish people that think that the US has a positive outlook on Turkey has now dropped to 2%. Most of the people, the majority of the people, think that the US has a hostile outlook on Turkey. That's the Turkish perception about the United States. And I think when you combine all of these things, it is difficult to remain optimistic, at least in the short run, that the relationship will improve. But at the end of the day, I think there will be a return to normalcy in this relationship, because Turkey's strategic interest, also it's the fact that Turkey remains a part of the Western alliance, means that this relationship will have to return to a more normal standing, but it will take some time. Benefit to some extent, but I think when we look at Turkey's trajectory in the Middle East and its policies in the Middle East, the fact that the US has now a disinclination to become a more visible actor in the Middle East has indeed opened up room for other actors, including Turkey, but also other actors like Russia and Iran. And at the end of the day, when you look at the consequences of US policies, starting with the Iraq intervention of 2003, this US policy has certainly not contributed to a regional order that is more conducive to Turkish interest. On the contrary, it has created a regional order that is now characterized by more instability, as the case has been with regard to Syria, where Iran's influence has increased. And therefore, when we look today at this US policy, it certainly has not been beneficial from the Turkish standpoint. But it has opened up room for Turkey to be more active. But that does not necessarily mean that the outcome of this regional dynamics, in the absence of a more visible US presence and investment, has been conducive to Turkish interests. Well, Turkey's position on Syria has changed radically over time. By 2011, Turkey was one of the first countries to have pulled the plug on Assad and engage in an aggressive policy of regime change in Syria. That's why Turkey did support many of the opposition groups in Syria in order to accelerate this outcome of this desired objective of regime change. But in the presence of a lack of appetite from its traditional partners in the West, and primarily the US, which has not been interested in a investment in a more ambitious policy to impact the developments on the ground in Syria, Turkey has had to accept the inevitability of Assad staying in power, at least for the foreseeable future. So eventually, Turkey had to partner with two other countries, Russia and Iran, which are not Turkey's natural partners, given that Turkey is a NATO member country. So today, Turkey's priorities over Syria have changed. It's not about regime change anymore. It is firstly about containing the influence and the territorial expansion of PYD, a Syrian Kurdish entity that is linked to the PKK, or terrorist organization. And secondly, Turkey also wants a return to normalcy in Syria, because Turkey has been, just like Lebanon, one of the countries that has been most affected by the ongoing civil strife in Syria, both from the humanitarian perspective. There are now more than 3 million Syrian refugees in Turkey, but also from the security perspective, being exposed to the threat of the Islamic State. And therefore, Turkey wants a return to a political normalcy and a political settlement in Syria. What Turkey will accept as a political settlement is going to be conditioned on two major factors. One, the fact that the Syrian Kurds be represented in the new order of Syria by way of disconnected cantons. What I mean by that is that there shouldn't be a contiguous Syrian Kurdish entity linking the different cantons, and that's also been the objective of the Turkish cross-border operation. So that's one clear condition for Turkey. And secondly, it's about Assad. Turkey does not want Assad to remain in power. Eventually, Ankara may be forced to agree for a temporary presence of Assad as a transitional figure, but fundamentally, there needs to be a leadership change in Syria.